Little
Good
feedback
morning.
there.
Yes, hello, good morning or good afternoon. Or I guess I should say good morning and good afternoon, because it is both at the same time. We're kind of time traveling right now. Good to see you all coming in, and happy new year, happy winter solstice, etc. We're excited to see all your faces again. Please make sure that you are muted while we do our opening introductions and everything, so that we don't get any feedback, or although if you have, like, meowing cats or barking dogs, that's always fine. We like our animal relatives to join us too. So we have a really great presentation and workshop and time to collaborate together ready for us today. Beginning of the year, it actually says January 19th, 2022 on there. So we are time traveling. I've been doing that too. I keep forgetting that it's 2023 and, signing things the wrong way. So I don't know what that means, but I'm glad it's a new year and a new time, that we have some fresh starts to make. So, but not a fresh start year, because this is our third webinar. So we are, after today, going to already be a quarter of the way through our time together. And what's really exciting is that today we're going to have presentations from two of our peers, and we get to hear about some of the work that they've been doing. So meanwhile, thank you, Catherine. Follow Catherine's lead and put your name and your information in the chat. That would be great. Oh, and I see a question from Robert. Is closed captioning available? You know what? I don't know. We don't have it enabled on our side, but I think it's something you might be able to enable on your side. So I'm trying to see if there's anything about closed captioning here. I don't see anything. You know what? We may have to do a little bit of research on that to find out how we get closed captioning enabled. So thank you for bringing that to our attention. All right, so just to reintroduce myself, I'm Shasta Gaughan, the Environmental Director, Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Paula Band of Mission Indians, Payonka-Witcham Territory, San Diego County, California, and the Director of the Tribal Climate Health Project. And here with Tina from my staff and Angie, our co-facilitator from Prosper Sustainably. And Angie, I'm going to turn it to you to talk about what we're doing today.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for coming back. We're really happy to be spending another couple of hours with you here in January. Today's topic is going to be focused on lessons on conducting tribal vulnerability assessments that incorporate traditional ecological knowledges, community input, and Western and Indigenous science. So we're excited because we do have two speakers who are going to tell us about their perspectives and how things went with their particular tribal community. And then we get to have lots of discussion throughout these 2 hours here today. Lots of different opportunities to engage with each other. So we're excited. And just a couple of reminders, the series objectives are up there on the right. So, this is a training. It's a little bit of a different kind of training. This one, we specifically targeted folks that have had some experience and want to continue to forge their tribal adaptation efforts further. And so a lot of this is peer exchange and learning from each other. And then just getting deeper into knowledge exchange and learning more about the linkages between health and climate change. So we're all here to help each other. And then at the end of the day, we're also developing these things we're calling wisdom wells, sort of taking in some of what we're learning from your experiences and helping to build out these wisdom wells documents that we're able to share more broadly with tribes that might be at the beginning of the process and can learn a little bit from you and from what we talk about in these forums. So we're excited. We have our community agreements, and we've been talking about that over the last couple. And if you have others to include, we'd be happy to take those on. Those are just ways for us to make sure we are getting through these workshops, these webinars in a way that feels good for everybody and where it's productive and that the discussion really has a chance to flourish. So let's dive in. Since the last webinar, when we got together the last time, we have a lot of resources that we've been sharing with you. And so one of the things is we were asking if folks still want to sign up to speak on a topic, you have a chance to do that in a peer sharing form. So that's been emailed out to you, but we're doing pretty good. I mean, I'm really thankful, grateful for folks who have been volunteering to speak on these topics. And so we have a chance to continue to reach out to people. And if you have an interest in any of the topics coming up, we would love to showcase your experience and your knowledge. Like I mentioned, the Wisdom Well, those have been emailed out to you as well. They're in the resource hub as well. So you can see what webinars 1 and 2 Wisdom Wells are looking like. It's really usually focused on there's a group discussion that we've been doing in Mural, and then we reformat that into something that summarizes and consolidates the input. But we'd love your feedback if you had any. The recordings have gone out. You've got access to the resource hub. If you ever have technical issues accessing anything, please let us know. We also have been sending out worksheets. There's a worksheet for this particular workshop as well, or this particular webinar. And I just want to make sure that folks know it's in the resource hub. And maybe Tina, if you have the ability, if you want to link people over to the resource hub, just to make sure you have an opportunity to get there. For webinar 3, we do have a worksheet. And I just want to make sure folks know that you can download those as a PDF. They're a fillable PDF. And it just kind of helps guide you through this particular webinar. And it's fillable so that you can jot down reflections or some prompts so that we can kind of keep track of what reflections, what thoughts you're having as we go through these trainings.
And I also just dropped the worksheet into the chat, so you can download it from there as well.
Good idea. Thank you. Well, one thing we asked you to do since last time, and it's okay if you didn't do your homework. It's not the longest document in the world, but sometimes we just suggest a reading. This time we suggested chapter 16, the most recent national climate assessment. So this is the nation's climate assessment. It's done every few years. It's in draft form right now. It's actually out for comment, but there is a chapter on tribes and indigenous people. And I thought, hey, that's interesting for folks here to take a look at. Know it exists. And if you feel really compelled, you could submit comment on it. But I'm interested in what folks thought about it. If you had a chance to review this on the right here is actually a diagram that's pulled out of this draft chapter, and I kind of liked it. An Indigenous holistic worldview. I'm curious what folks think of that. But here's some suggested prompts for our discussion. We've got a little time here for some reading discussion. There's 3 key messages. And if you had a chance to look, which one resonated with you the most? Did anything surprise you? And then if you did review this, how might you use this report once final in your future adaptation planning, or just simply summarize what you took away from this resource, or any other thoughts you might have had? So we'll open it up for a little discussion for anybody who'd like to share some thoughts on this reading.
Yes, Catherine.
So when I read about the climate change and things like that, and the one thing that I always look at is if anybody's actually addressed the change of the water balance, because that's, I think, one of the most important things to understand, and it doesn't. So, and there is a real big, huge tipping point with our water balance. I mean, we're finding more, we've seen it, the atmospheric rivers have been, dropping everything down, and that's not. And I'm talking with Forest Service, their water balance, they don't take into account the depletion of groundwater. They don't take into account the increase in humidity. So I think that's one thing that needs to be really addressed, is the change in the water balance. And I found that missing.
Thank you. Yeah. It's a high level overview of some things that would require a lot more in-depth discussion of, but yeah, I think I can agree with you there. Who else has some thoughts here?
Hey, good morning. For those that don't know me yet, I'm Anne Turcotte. I'm from Acosta, and what I read through that, what I understand and took away from that, is that tribal communities do a lot against climate change with little resource. Like we work hard, but we don't have that much resource. We do whatever we can with that, but it will be fun to see other communities do just as much with their resources.
Yeah, thanks, Anne. That comes up all the time, right?
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I observed in this reading, just in looking at some of the key messages, we've got key messages that are here that are focused on health specifically. And it just got me to thinking about all the different ways in which health is affected by climate change, but how specific that needs to be when it comes to tribal community health. And maybe it needs to be a little bit more specific, and Catherine, I see you nodding, and yet at the same time, when we're talking about an overview, it's like, how do we include everything that needs to be included when we want this general report? And that's really hard to do, because you can't generalize about these really, really specific effects that are happening. It's hard. Yeah, Catherine.
So I know that, one thing that a lot of other documents have also mistakenly excluded is the temperature and its great effect on how microbes are taking advantage of the warmer temperatures and just increasing. That's why I was nodding my head, the health, because our microbial communities are becoming they're able to spread faster. They're able to go up into higher climate zones where they were never able to go up higher in elevation, because the higher elevations are now becoming warmer. So we're seeing even the cyanobacteria, the algae. The algae love warm temperatures. They love 85 degrees and above. And that's why we're seeing huge algal blooms everywhere. And that seems to also be being ignored or just mistakenly excluded. I mean, the temperature, every system, no matter if it's chemical, living, whatever, every system is highly dependent upon temperature changes. So.
Yeah, funny you should mention that. Oh, and off she goes. I love that t-shirt. Knowledges of the land. That was from our conference in October.
Yeah,
that's awesome. And this is sort of funny, but it's fiction, but it could be true. I just started watching that new show on HBO, The Last of Us, and that show is predicated on the idea that warming temperatures have made humans an ideal host for a fungus that takes over your brain and turns you into a zombie. And I'm like, wow, climate change is gonna, it's gonna make the fungus, take over.
That's exactly actually what happens to flies and ants.
Yeah.
I mean, there are fungus that invades their neural network and it takes over their whole system. So I wouldn't be surprised if that were to actually occur one of these days.
Well, maybe you and I can talk separately about the show, because it's a great show. But in any case, the messages they're very general. So does anybody else have any takeaways from any of the key messages, or anything in the report that you think is missing or that you were glad to see?
You can raise your hand or chat it, either way.
Or just do like me and just start talking.
Yeah, sure. Well, I see Grayton here has put in the chat that the diagram is awesome. So yeah, I thought it was useful. That might be something I use in our work here.
And a very similar diagram was used in the ITAP Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals. They did the National Tribal and Indigenous, wait, no, that's the climate conference I'm thinking of, but the report that they wrote on the effects of climate change on Indigenous communities had a very similar diagram. I mean, there's how many key messages there's usually 3 key messages in each of these different chapters. And so I find that I feel like there should be more, that it's really hard to just limit it to only 3 key messages. But at the same time, the reason they don't have more than that is because otherwise you'd end up having, 72 key messages. It's not really key anymore. But one thing I feel like needs a little bit more attention is the effects on tribal cultural resources, because there's a little paragraph on culture, but there's definitely more to it than just a paragraph, a half a page can cover.
For the
Yeah. Go ahead,
Heidi,
Heidi.
for the cultural part, I think that a lot of grants don't include anything cultural in it, and I think it would be important for them to allow any kind of cultural, I guess, education to be included, because it is very important, and a lot of the youth doesn't know anything about it. So we would need to incorporate like traditional uses, how to grow traditional medicines, and none of these grants focus on any of that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's 100% true. And we know, those of us who get EPA GAP funds, that you're not allowed to explicitly include cultural resources in your GAP work plan. And that is really unfortunate. But, if we can get a message like that into a report like this, then maybe there's more opportunity to get some of the funders to understand. And let's see, there's a question in the chat. When do we think this report will be final and public to start quoting from for future grants? Good question.
Good
I don't
question.
know.
I have to go look. Let me go look back at NCA and I'll get back to you, because I don't know the timeline, the top of my head.
This
But yeah,
stuff
right now
tends
they're
to take a
asking not
while.
to quote.
And we
They
also,
don't
each of your
reference it yet.
states, oh, sorry, Angie.
It's just they're noting here, it's not, yeah, I think you saw it. We can't reference it yet.
Yeah, not yet final. Oh, hi, Kimberly. Did I hear someone? No, still, we've been doing this for so long and it's still not perfect, the whole Zoom interface, but we do what we can. Yeah, and then one more thing that I'll add, just because I always have too much to say, is I want to see a little bit more acknowledgement of the importance of protecting tribal knowledge, because a lot of this stuff that we're talking about is very tribally specific. So if you're going to protect things that have cultural significance, you've got to be able to justify protecting them without having to say why. I was having this conversation with some folks from California yesterday on one of their new grant programs for tribes. And my question was, how are you going to protect the knowledge that tribes might be including in some of the reports or the work that you're funding? You've got to make it okay for the tribes to say, thanks for the money. We promise we're doing the right thing with it, but we can't tell you why this resource is important, because that's traditional knowledge that is confidential. So I would like to see a little bit of that Indigenous knowledge and tribal traditional knowledge is a wonderful resource, but it needs to be protected so that tribes can be the decision makers on whether or not it is public.
So that's a really good segue into what we're going to talk about here today, because what we really need to hear from you all is, as you start, the start of the process with the adaptation planning is usually a vulnerability assessment of some kind. And how do you use traditional ecological knowledge, among other Indigenous science and Western science and other sources of information, to really take a close look at what your vulnerabilities are, so that we get to talk about that today. And I'm excited about it. And even how do we do that when we're talking about the cultural resources that are often sensitive information. So we are excited to get into it. And I want to say thank you for that discussion. One last thing to say, Shasta, you may not know, you may not have seen this. They actually reference Tribal Climate Health Project in this chapter.
What?
Did you know? We're famous.
I did not know that. I didn't read it closely enough, I guess.
Yeah, we're in it. So that's kind of fun. All right. Anything else to say here? Let's see, Ryan. I think we can give them a broader overview while withholding the details. Yeah. Yep. Cool. So the next thing we have on our agenda is just, we want to kind of set the groundwork for the conversation, just a little more depth into the topic. So I thought we'd share what some of the curriculum we sometimes share in our trainings, but really just to wet the whistle, because we're going to hear from folks doing the work on the ground, and we want to hear, what you all are doing out there. So, and for the Tribal Climate Health Project, we typically use this as our framework when we talk about the adaptation planning process. And like I said, vulnerability assessment often comes first. So you'll do the first one probably is your heaviest lift. After that, a vulnerability assessment, its goal is to really identify a community's threats, its risks, its important assets, its strengths, any particular sensitivities, any ability that they have to adapt. And so it's looking at how is climate change going to affect a community? How vulnerable are we to those impacts? Once you know those and can prioritize those vulnerabilities, then we usually follow with an adaptation plan. And that's really this two-step process. It's what are the problems and then how are we going to address it? You all know this, but an adaptation plan will often take the vulnerabilities that are addressed in the assessment and then try to figure out how do we mitigate those? How do we reduce or eliminate the concerns or the threats by taking some sort of action or intervention? And then on an ongoing basis, there's, you're continuously adopting and implementing, evaluating and updating these reports. And that's generally, but it doesn't always have to go that way, and it doesn't have to be as linear as all of that. When you look at the different types of models and practices, that's kind of generally how the steps go. Last time when we met, we mainly talked about this first step, step one, which was, we talked a lot about scope. How do you scope your adaptation efforts? That was like maybe sort of a confusing conversation, but it becomes really important at the beginning of the vulnerability assessment process to understand what is it that we're looking to actually evaluate. And at the end of the day, this sets the stage for how will we actually adapt? What are we adapting to? And so getting really clear on that. That's kind of what we talked about last time is, things like who's involved and what are the parameters? How are you going to scope out this thing? Are you going to look at all of your impacts? Are you going to look at all of the exposures? Are you looking at what's your boundaries? Who are you involving? So that was more last time. And really that becomes what we have talked about as step one in a vulnerability assessment, is to get really clear on what it is you're looking at. One thing I want to share with you, and I'm actually going to throw the link here in the chat when I get a second. We have a web page that walks you through the steps as we've outlined them. It's on our website. It's what we think of as like steps in doing a vulnerability assessment. And each of these plus signs kind of shares with you where there are assets or some kind of resource that you can use that might make the process easier. So, but if you've already done this, you probably have your own resources. But I'll share this link with you so that you can be following along. And if you want to click on any of the resources and see if it's useful to you, great. Over here on the right is the 6 steps as we kind of think of them. And so I'll talk a little bit more just about steps 2 through 6, and then we'll hear from you. So this slide covers what we think of as steps 2 through 4. Again, there's no one right way to do it, and it doesn't have to be linear, but the idea is that getting good information is really key to the adaptation planning process, but that we know that fact-finding can be overwhelming and really time-consuming. So today, I hope we have a chance to talk a little bit about how do we do some of these things. So number 2 here is engage the community. If it hasn't already been done, a lot of people do the engagement from step 1. Sometimes they're engaging the community and even scoping out what should be evaluated. And then you're going to continue to engage the community all throughout the rest of the vulnerability assessment and the adaptation plan and beyond. But there's a couple ways that we kind of break this down of how to do it. But the idea here is that engaging the community has a lot of benefits, including gathering knowledge, oral histories, stories, observations, traditional knowledges. You can learn about concerns and existing resilience and preparedness activities. You can determine what community assets are most valued. What's most important? What does the community care about? And I've done this. So enough communities that I would never be able to walk in and predict what a community cares about if I don't ask, if I don't specifically ask, because it varies from community to community. Some communities might say our educational opportunities are our number one thing we're looking to protect, and another says water, and another says economic viability. So this is an opportunity to hear from the community. And then so yeah, we talk about establishing a planning team. That's usually one way to do it, where you're making sure that you have key departments and outside advisors, including health, ideally, as part of a team that's really driving the process, sort of a smaller team, and then more broadly engaging community members. And that could be stakeholders, but it's obviously tribal members, elders, youths, other partners, And we think of those as active or passive, meaning active meaning it's like a two-way communication. We're asking something of them. Maybe we're doing a workshop or a survey or conducting interviews, and we're asking for input and feedback and information. And then the more passive approach is just to make sure you're informing and educating the community on what you're working on. And so you'll see when I post this link, we just posted, Paula has a really great website. So Shasta's her department has a great website where she's sharing what she knows about how the climate changes are going to affect Paula, and all the reports and all the information and what they're working on next. And it's just a way to ensure that their community is being informed. There's some other resources here that are useful. So I will talk about that in just a second, but so step 3, and actually we could spend probably 3 hours just talking about strategies for engaging the communities, but we'll have some time to do that here today. 3 is identifying key indicators, and that just generally means what will you measure to understand your vulnerabilities? So indicators meaning what are some ways of understanding what is changing? So from historical to current to future projections, what are the trends looking like, and what is it that we're going to look at? So an indicator might look like something like well water depth. It might look like something like snow water equivalent. It might look like heat, temperature changes. We have a tool where we have hundreds of indicators with potential data sources for them. We'll share that with you too. So getting clear on what it is you're going to look, how are you going to measure the vulnerabilities? What are you going to look at? And then you go out and you get information. So that's 4, gathering and analyzing the information. So once you've engaged your community, you figure out what you're going to measure, then you go out and you look for information to try to get a gauge on where the trend, what's happening in the trends, and where are the concerns really lying? How soon are those concerns going to present themselves? And so that really is a process of finding the best data to tell the story. And that comes from a lot of different places. So meaningful information can be found internally or externally. And other organizations call it a braided approach when you're using both. So capturing as much information, again, back to from your community, from community members and tribal members and whatever records that you have, to external information as well. So internal information might be your traditional knowledges, if that becomes something that is able to be shared as part of this process. But local observations, so that might just be, like I said, a survey of what people's current perspectives are. And then any tribal report studies or data or mapping. And then external information could be a wide variety of things, including credible reports and studies. We have a directory that we'll share with you of some technical assistance providers that can provide some free assistance here and help you, help with analyzing, usually Western data sources. And then there's all sorts of publicly accessible databases, and you all know this because you've been through it, but sometimes they're available by data request. More and more, it's becoming accessible publicly just online through these pretty cool toolkits or databases that have nice visualizations. But there's so much of it. There's so much to look at, and there's still gaps. So it'll be interesting what you all have to say about that process, getting information. So typically when we think about vulnerability assessments, we're looking at vulnerability as a function of a few things, and maybe this resonates with you in the work that you've done, but you're looking at the exposure risk, meaning, so for us, we talk about temperature, storms and flooding, drought, wildfire, melting ice and sea level rise. What's changing with those exposures in our particular boundary or our location? What's the impact risk? So if we know that storms and flooding are going to create an impact to water systems and increasing, like what Catherine was talking about, water systems having an increase in pathogens and contamination that might create gastrointestinal illnesses or other impacts. What does that look like? What are those changes looking like? What are the possibilities? And do we have information about how bad it's going to get and how soon? And then population sensitivity is really a function of what characteristics in our community make us particularly sensitive. So for communities like here in Southern California, heat is a big issue. A lot of times we look at whether or not a community has access to how many of the households have access to air conditioning. That's one indicator of many indicators of population sensitivity, or say how reliant upon local food systems is a community versus having access to more distributed food environments. And then adaptive capacity. Are there already things in place that are strengths that increase a tribe's capacity to adapt? So that might look like, maybe a tribe's built a microgrid and is no longer as vulnerable to power outages, or maybe they have a seed program where they're trying to protect their food. There's a huge variety of things, and it's basically strengths and interventions that already are in place to help with adaptation. And so vulnerability can be complex to figure out because it's a function of all of these. And this is just to say that, if you've done this work, you know that the volume of potential impacts is overwhelming. If you look at all of them, if you're really trying to do a comprehensive look, here we're just looking at a few things that are just health related. We're looking at air quality resulting from wildfire smoke. We're looking at flood vulnerability. We're looking at change in national crop yield, just like a food security indicator, looking at changes in the mortality rate as heat extreme increases, changes in Lyme disease, case report distribution. These are a few of very many things that are worth looking at. And the idea is to, there's so much. How do you balance this with not being stuck in a paralyzing analysis for too long, not overwhelming your community, but also not leaving critical blind spots? What I always get worried about sometimes with any community I work with is, did we not look at something really critical? And we'll hear from Catherine, she talks a lot about watershed. Maybe if we had looked at the right set of information, we would have seen that water security was the #1 issue, but because we didn't have the right information to look at, we missed it. So we invested in other things that maybe were less critical. So that's kind of the point of the vulnerability assessment, is like, let's really understand what needs our attention the most. And this is just some examples of how we collect some internal vulnerability information, but I would love to hear from folks that are doing a really good job here collecting the perspectives and knowledge of their community. So we have a resource and we can share it. This is the Climate Vulnerability Experiences and Priorities Survey. It's free, it's a Google form, you can use it. It's a cheap and easy way, but let's face it, if we had more resource, the best thing to do would be to spend lots of time doing really deep and meaningful engagement with tribal members. And so there are communities that have done things like the Macaw tribe, developed a community engagement process to inform and create the foundation for the tribe's full climate adaptation process. They use lots of methods, including hosting community dinners to share information and gather input. And then another one, so a lot of folks know about the Swinomish. We got some grant funding and they spent nearly a year on deep engagement to determine what they call their Indigenous health indicators. So if you have the resource to do things a lot more in detail, great. Not everybody has the resource to do it. Other things that could be done in-house or sometimes GIS. So this is just an example from Paula in doing some internal GIS with some consultant help, looking at their fire risk and flood risk in relation to a transportation adaptation plan that they had conducted. So some of this work can be done in-house. Lots of other internal analysis that I always pull from if I'm working with the community. It could look like a invasive species plan, a habitat plan, a soil erosion study, a hazard mitigation plan is a big one. So what information do you already have access to that can be useful? And then external information. So this is just a real quick snapshot of the EASY tool, exposures, impacts, and strategies inventory. This is something we built just to collect an inventory of the exposures, secondary exposures, and impacts that we're aware of and what the research says, how the research presents the interactions between those. It's like the relationship. So like temperature has a correlation to a secondary exposure of increased ozone. So that's an air quality issue, has a relationship to respiratory illness. And then it looks at how would you measure that. So there's a list of like a menu of indicators. And then it provides national and national data sources, or if you're in California, state resources. And so those are places that we know that you can go for information if you don't have anything better in-house. And so we'll share that as well. So we have all these tools, but you know, you've been through this. If you have your own process, great. So then 5 and 6, just quickly to wrap up here, is usually once you've looked at all of your vulnerabilities and you've mined all this information, and hopefully you put it into some sort of worksheet that you can do some analysis on trends, you're trying to figure out your priorities. Which of these vulnerabilities need our attention the most? So that usually involves determining who's going to rank and how you're going to rank those vulnerabilities. Again, it's usually a community engagement process, because you know, there will be different perspectives about which of the vulnerabilities are most critical, even though you might have some very objective data behind it. And so you'll evaluate some criteria that you develop, and you'll use all your indicator data to make ranking decisions and bring in. This is where I think a lot of communities, not just tribal communities, kind of miss an opportunity. It's connecting the data and the information back to what the community cares about. So it's just factoring in. So say the community said that economic opportunity was a really important thing that was being threatened by climate change, an important asset to protect. And we want to make sure that then anything that's going to affect those critical economic facilities is going to be something that ranks pretty high, and make sure that that gets addressed. And then usually folks synthesize and present the results. Sometimes this is optional, because you might just roll this into the adaptation plan. Sometimes it's all one document. There's all sorts of different ways to present this. It could be in a report. I've seen it done in a video. I've seen it done in a slideshow. Usually it's in a report. There's all sorts of approaches to how to do that as well, and all sorts of different cases. You know, we could look at a lot of different case studies. Paula's adaptation plan is something that's available online in a Word version. So we encourage folks to just take that template, take whatever text is useful to you, and then customize the rest. And so that's another resource that we offer. So that's all I really wanted to share here from our perspective, just to get you thinking, like, what is it? If you maybe just need to remember, what's a vulnerability assessment look like again? That's how we see it. Tell us how you see it. Tell us what steps you've taken. And so we're actually going to take this moment now to go out into some breakouts. We're going to break you out into triads because we want to give you a chance to get to know each other a little bit. So just introduce yourself. We've got 8 minutes here. And I just want to invite you to share a success or a lesson from your work on tribal vulnerability assessment. So it's a quick kind of check in with each other. All right. Any questions on what we're doing?
It's pretty straightforward. I'm about to hit create. You're going to be automatically assigned to a room with 2 other people. And yeah, just answer these questions, and we can copy them into the chat as well, so you can see them when you're in the room. So 3, 2, 1.
Hi, everybody. We had a nice chat. Give me a thumbs up if 8 minutes felt like the right amount of time to check in with a couple of folks.
We only had 2 people. We got salty.
Oh, you got salty?
Kimberly,
Okay.
Kimberly, you said you only had 2 in your room?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it just, you know, you just have to, it just breaks up the way it breaks up. So some people ended up with a few short, but I hope you and Ryan had a good conversation.
We did, and I think 8 minutes felt pretty good for the 2 of us. We were pretty much wrapped up when it was closing down.
I felt that for a room of 3 that we could use a little bit more time, but we, at the end, one of our, John got cut off there, but a little bit longer for 3 would have been great.
No,
Okay.
thanks for the feedback. And yeah,
And
there's
highlight.
always that awkward moment where somebody gets chopped off in the middle of saying something really profound, or kind of like when you wake up from a dream and you're like, I want to remember that great idea I had in the dream. And then by the time you get up to brush your teeth, it's like,
They started playing the music during my acceptance speech.
Oh, sorry, John. You know, yeah, we had the shepherd's crook where we're like,
Yeah.
I love that analogy. They should have that on there when the countdown's happening, like the little piano player.
Well,
well,
wait, it's not the only breakout. We got another breakout coming that's going to be longer today.
but with more people in it too, so we'll have to be careful with time.
Yeah. Okay. So thanks for that. We're going to move into our speakers. So every time we get together, we're going to invite a couple of the folks that are attendees of these trainings to actually speak and have a little time to share their experiences in a little more depth. So each of these speakers has 10 minutes to share with you something related to the topic, vulnerability assessments, and how they're gathering information from their communities and other places. So Shasta, you are going to introduce our speaker.
Yes. So Sheila, are you with us? I saw your picture a little bit ago.
Yes, I'm here. Thank you.
Hi. Also, I'm curious, what are you holding in that photo?
Yeah, that is a plate that we use for detecting invasive species, specifically tunicates. So we hang those off of our docks and allow tunicates to settle and then pull them up later to see if there are any invasive tunicates present.
All right, let me test my biology. A tunicate, those are things like sponges, right?
Right.
Okay. All right, cool. Because when I hear tunicates, I just think of one of those sandwich kits that you can make a tuna sandwich with, a tunicate. Anyway, this is Sheila Shishkin. Now, please tell me how to pronounce your name correctly.
Shishkin, you got it.
Shishkin. I was close. And I'm going to let you pronounce the name of your tribe because I want to make sure that it's pronounced correctly.
Yeah, it's the Kawalangan tribe of Unalaska.
All right, so Sheila from the Kawalangan tribe of Unalaska is our first speaker today, resilience coordinator for the tribe. And Sheila, take it away.
Thank you, Shasta. All right, everybody. Ang kilach alamach isach the cooking. Good morning. My name is Sheila Shishkin. I work for the Kawalangan tribe of Unalaska. I actually recently got promoted to resilience program manager. And I'm here to talk to you guys today about ways that we incorporate traditional ecological knowledge, community input, and Western Indigenous science into our resilience work. So I'll start off by talking about climate adaptation plans and vulnerability assessments, specifically what they mean to us. And then I'll move into our approach with these documents as well as next steps. So what is a climate adaptation plan? When I first started working in resilience and was brought this project, my first question is like, what is it? And you know, when you say climate adaptation plan, the idea, the gist of it is pretty obvious, right? Well, my questions were, what's required in these documents? What's the format? Who do we have to work with? So some of those logistical questions. And what I found out pretty quickly by looking at other plans from other tribes is that these documents are very customizable and that they can be built to fit your community as they should. And so for us, the adaptation plan really serves as a roadmap. And what I mean by that is it paves the road to our future projects, our future funding sources we want to seek out, and essentially the work that we want to do to jump in front of some of these issues we're seeing. And really this plan, to me, serves as a token of our resilience because we have been, you know, seeing changes in the climate and we're struggling in ways, but creating a climate adaptation plan and then implementing that plan, jumping ahead of these things, is really the key for us to continuing to steward these lands as we have for thousands of years. And so oftentimes in my work, I turn to our Nungan values. These are a set of values that define who we are and our morals and how we want to exist in the world. So I've included a lot of them in my presentation today, and I'll be reading them off to you. So here we have Tuman Tanach Aglisachtin, take care of the water. Tuman Alagos Aglisachtin, take care of the ocean. Next slide, please. Okay, so vulnerability assessment. I won't go too deep into this one. We have been discussing it, but I just wanted to touch on it. Like we said, there's some key components to a climate vulnerability assessment. And really, a vulnerability assessment and an adaptation plan overlap in many ways regarding the content that they hold, but the approach and the way that this information is used is what's different. And I just put a sort of a sentence here that describes, you know, why this document might be useful. And I thought it was really well put. So it says, it's beneficial for informing and equipping decision makers to better identify threats, communicate challenges, and proactively respond to emerging environmental concerns identified by the community itself. And then to bring it back to our values, once again, we have Usugulech Awakun, we are working together. Next slide, please. Okay, so our approach when we are working with these documents and completing these projects is, you know, the overarching goal of two-eyed seeing. And if you're not familiar with that term, two-eyed seeing is essentially the integration of both indigenous knowledge and Western science, basically seeing each out of one eye so that we can see what we have as a fuller picture. And bringing these two things together can increase our efficiency in these projects. So one, for our indigenous knowledge, how do we bring this into our projects? Well, first of all, Unangan people, which are the native people to the Aleutian region in Alaska, these are our lands and our waters, and the Unangan people are the first to uh-oh, I got muted there. So the Unangan people are the first to realize when something changes in the environment, and that's because of the relationship with the land and water and the subsistence lifestyle. So the Unangan people are out there, they're in the element, so when something changes, they know. So in order to bring the community input and that traditional ecological knowledge, we, for both of these projects, create what we call a Gustilich committee. And essentially what that is a working group. And it consists of tribal members. This is also a paid working group, I want to point out. I think it's important to compensate our indigenous people for their intellectual knowledge and intellectual labor. As we create these documents, we have quarterly talking circles where we come together with our committee and we go over the things that we have come up with. We talk about concerns, we identify threats, and we just have an open discussion about what these things are and what we want to do about them. And then in terms of Western science, one of our first steps in these projects was finding out what data is out there. And what we found out, and what we already kind of knew, is that we are dealing with the data desert, really. And that is pretty surprising because our location in Alaska, and you might know us better as the port of Dutch Harbor from the show Deadliest Catch, we are a very strategic location, and that means that we have a lot of vessel traffic because of the shipping industry. We're also the largest fishing port in the nation in terms of exports, and we have been for more than the past 20 years. Once again, an Unangan value here, we have Manachin Ilam Achtalakin Aglisachin, and that is do not do anything to excess. I think that's probably my favorite Unangan value, as it can be applied to so many different things. Next slide, please. Okay, and here we have what's next, what comes of these processes, what do we do once we're done? And I've listed here some of the actual next steps that we came up with in these processes that were identified and brought forward by our Gustila committee. And so these are what is important to the community. And that is really what we're looking for in this. We don't want to create, you know, a document or a plan that isn't what represents the people and what they want. So this list is just a snippet of what our tribal members want to see what they want to see our tribe doing, the work that they want us to do in order to jump in front of some of these climate issues. And so I'm not going to read through all of them, but you will see up at the top that one of our next steps is to do a vulnerability assessment. And so we're in the process of starting that up. And then also I just wanted to touch on the one below it. This is sort of a dream project for me, and that is to collect and document Unangak traditional ecological knowledge through audio recorded interviews. Like I mentioned before, we don't have that Western baseline data, but what we do have is extensive amounts of baseline data in the form of traditional ecological knowledge. So down with our knowledge holders and with our elders and recording conversations that we have, of course, with their permission, is a form of baseline data. And it's something that I am seeking out to do in the near future, so that we can establish that. And really quickly, on the left here, you'll see we have our Unangak seasonal subsistence calendar. Smallest ring represents family activities for around the year, and then we have the middle ring that represents plants and animals gathered throughout the year, and the largest ring represents the types of animals hunted at different times of year. This is a calendar for our region and the traditional foods that we eat, so I wanted to include that in there and share that with you guys as well. And last but not least, I just want to bring it back again to our Nungan values. You know, the big question is, what is this work for? You know, why are we doing it? What's the big picture? And for me, the answer is this value here, and it's Anikvin Nigin Akalen Angangen Kulikin Akuch Kumal, and that means for the coming generations that we don't see yet for their time here. That wraps up my presentation today. Thank you everybody for allowing me this space, and I look forward to the question and answers coming up soon.
Thank you, Sheila. That was fantastic, and really appreciate you sharing with us. And we're already seeing some questions come in, but before we get to the questions, we're going to hear from our next speaker. This is Catherine Buchanan from it says it's Elk Valley Rancheria in California. She's the Environmental Services Director, and she's wearing an awesome t-shirt today. All right, Catherine, take it away. Catherine, you're muted. Is she still with us?
Yeah.
There she is. Okay, there you are.
So it's to understand vulnerabilities, it's essential to understand the water balance and knowing your watershed and how you can plan for resilience. Next slide, please. So I put this up here because I want to emphasize the ocean warming. This is a picture of the glacier that has melted into the Antarctica Ocean, the size of New York City. And remember that 90% of the glacier is under the waterline. So in order for the top part to melt away, that means the bottom part had to melt first. So how deep is the water of the ocean warming? It's got to be at least, several hundred feet deep, because who knows how big a glacier is. So that is extremely telling of how fast our oceans are warming. Next slide, please. So our water balance is basically solid, liquid, and vapor, correct? And next slide, please. And this is just to remind people that all of the water on Earth is bound by the atmosphere. We have an a finite amount of water. No water is coming in from outer space and no water leaves to outer space. Next slide, please. So people talk about this 2 degrees and people are like, oh, well, 2 degrees Fahrenheit. No, it's 2 degrees Celsius, which means it is 3.56 degrees Fahrenheit that our oceans have warmed up by. Snow falls and stays at 32 degrees Fahrenheit. So what this means to me as a former ski instructor, that 3.56 degrees Fahrenheit, that means we have to wait for an extremely cold blast of Arctic air to come down or something to happen before it snows again, because it means on the thermometer, it is 35.6 degrees Fahrenheit. That means no snow and a decreased water storage. I mean, and remember, the oceans control the global temperatures. Next slide, please. Everybody's experienced latent heat of vaporization. It's the amount of energy needed to create a phase change in water. So it goes from solid to liquid, liquid to vapor. Everybody's seen this. Throw a cup of water out onto the sidewalk. Water does not need to boil for energy to be added to water, and it goes up in water vapor. Next slide, please. So what does that mean to the water balance? So that means the increased energy added to the oceans is actually evaporating more water into the atmosphere. I mean, 75% of the world's surface is ocean, right? So think of how many trillions of gallons of water are now entering the atmosphere every single day. And we've all seen the results. We've just experienced, this past storm. Everybody's talking about the atmospheric rivers now that are in the atmosphere. And we've all seen the 40 tornadoes that have already happened. And we're seeing more and more severe hurricanes. And it means, and the droughts. So less water on the land means more water in the atmosphere, longer droughts, and an increased frequency and intensity of storms, floods, landslides, etc. So that's why it's extremely important to know the water balance. Next slide, please. So how has the water balance changed, and is it being tracked? Well, we have increases in humidity, less land on water, no snow. We've seen that with Lake Mead. And when we decrease the vegetation, such as the trees, or just cutting them down like crazy, you have less groundwater recharge, and faster runoff results in less ground infiltration into the groundwater. And click on that, there's some more. No. Okay, so the jet stream, again, we've all seen it, the atmospheric rivers, the increase in turbulence. And then one thing that people forget is when you have more mass up in the atmosphere, water vapor, the wind intensity is going to have more force. So, and winds have a greater drying effect. They're going to travel farther, and it's going to increase the transpiration in plants, meaning that they're going to pull more water out of the ground. Next slide, please. So water vapor was confirmed as a major player in climate change in November of 2008 by NASA. Next slide. And currently in 2022, they actually understand how water vapor increases the heat on Earth. And they found out that water vapor radiates heat back down to the Earth in all directions. So that is, it is warming the planet. Next slide, please. Just to remind people of how this happens, water vapor in the desert, for those of us who have lived in the desert, when you don't have any clouds overhead, extremely cold, right? You have water freezing in the ponds, and then when you have clouds overhead, it's warm at night. Next slide, please. And this is just to show you that in Vegas, an arid desert, the average annual percentage of humidity is now over 30%. That should give everybody a big, huge warning sign. Next slide, please. Back one. No, I'm sorry. Yep, next slide. Okay, so the weight of water, the water vapor in the atmosphere, weight is equal to mass times gravitational acceleration. Force is equal to mass times acceleration. Potential energy, everything is based on the mass. So when you have more mass up in the atmosphere, that means you're going to have more force. greater momentum. The storms are going to travel farther. And we're seeing all of that take place. We're seeing higher winds where winds never used to be a danger before. We're seeing more storms, more forceful storms. And it's it's like now you have a locomotive, a train engine pulling the jet stream instead of a small truck. Next slide, please. So to do a proper watershed assessment, know your topography. You have to know where the water's falling. You have to plan for that. And it's not about stopping the water because you're not going to be able to stop it. You have to look at the land and figure out how can it be diverted? How can it be spread out in order to decrease that force? Next slide, please. You also need to understand the soils. Here on the West Coast, all of our soils on the West Coast, we have very young mountains, and they're composed basically of plant matter. So they're highly erodible. However, we do have bedrock under these soils. So how far down to bedrock do we need to go? And just like Alaska too, Alaska has bedrock under the permafrost. So you can build foundation under that, on top of that, or even go with floating houses. Next slide, please. In order, again, to do a comprehensive watershed assessment, you need to know what is in the watershed, know the history of the watershed, look at the road system, see how much impermeable surfaces there are, because the more impermeable surfaces means the faster the water is going to run off and more likely it's going to flood. If you'll take a look at the satellite picture and where all the forest is, all of those little brown dots, that's clear cuts. Those are clear cut areas. So you have to know your vegetative cover too. Clear cut areas means there's going to be less infiltration into the groundwater. Next slide, please. Keep clicking because I didn't mean for this to be one at a time. So the effects, the activities exacerbating climate change are the mining, oil, fracking, and then the real estate development, again, impermeable surfaces, urban sprawl, all of these exacerbate the effects of climate change because they all take water away, they all add heat to the atmosphere, and then the heat gets absorbed by the ocean, which means the oceans continue to warm up, more water evaporates, and it continues. Next slide, please. So these are pictures of open pit mines and one that was drilled into the mountain. As you can see, the water is just being drained like crazy from the hilltops. And if you'll take a look at the area around these open pit mines, the land is extremely dry. So we need to figure out how to stop mining irresponsibly, number one, and how to make these guys clean up this mess. Because an aquifer is like a bathtub. You poke a hole in the bathtub, wherever that hole is going to be, you're going to drain all the water out. Now the open pit mines, they have the hole at the bottom of the bathtub. So everything above is going to drain out into that. Next slide, please. And this is 2 maps from 2020. On the left-hand side, as you're looking at it, those are all the maps of the fire. Those are all the locations of the fires from 2020. And on the right-hand side, the abandoned mines. The patterns are pretty much the same. Next slide, please. And again, this is the fires from 2020 and the abandoned oil wells. And again, you have very similar patterns. I don't think this is a coincidence. Too much of a coincidence. Next slide, please. So ways that we can be resilient is choose our construction materials. Use white roofing tiles instead of black. We are going to, the bottom picture on the left-hand side, that's a alternative paving. It's a geocell instead of asphalt, which actually encourages plant growth and keeps the surfaces cooler. That house is made of gigacrete and it's actually fire resistant and it is non-heat absorbing. Well, it absorbs less heat than the traditional or conventional that they use construction materials now. Next slide, please. And again, more low impact strategies to reduce your heat impact. Next slide, please. Next slide. And so what can we do to decrease our contribution? So this is an article, and it says, you know, climate change forces tribes to leave traditional lands behind. And in it that, you know, Deb Haaland is saying that we have $45 million for climate resilience projects. Okay, so one thing that I really like to point out, next slide, please. I am tired of hearing relocation for tribes. Over on the Eastern Seaboard, they call it beach replenishment. Congress has given $1.9 billion to $3 billion over, I'm sure that the majority of the cost has been in the past 30 years to the Eastern Seaboard. And they keep telling us that we need to relocate. And this is current. This is current. And then, and they're talking about for in perpetuity. One lady that was interviewed on the Eastern Seaboard, she is claiming that the Eastern Seaboard is like national parks, and they're talking about their private homes, the privately owned homes. Okay, so if she's like a national park, then that means anybody can go into her house and use her bathroom, her kitchen, and pitch a tent on her living room floor, right? Well, no, she can't do that. People aren't allowed to go into their homes. So how are you like a national park? But when it comes to tribal communities, they say, we have no money. We can't help you. Okay, so relocation, my stance is you tell the people on the Eastern Seaboard to relocate first, and then we'll visit relocation. If we get the money, we're going to do it right the first time. And it's only going to be basically either a 1 or 2 year project funding. They're talking about year after year for in perpetuity. They get millions of dollars every single year for sand, for privately owned residences on the Eastern Seaboard. This is why, to me, relocation is not an option. There are better ways. There are sustainable ways. There are for us to be resilient, and we can do it. It's not going to cost us millions and millions of dollars every single year. That's why I am relocation, not an option. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. That was terrific. I was taking copious notes, and I don't remember if we asked if we could share your presentation, but I hope we can share the slides with the rest of the group.
Yes.
All right. Awesome. Yeah, there's so many things to consider, and I think there's going to be a lot of questions for both of you. So we can go back to some of the questions that were put into the chat. Starting for Sheila's presentation. And if you would like to unmute yourselves and ask those questions, you can do that too. So Kendra, do you want to ask your questions out loud?
Sure. I was curious, when I started working with a team to define kind of community and what we were writing this vulnerability assessment for, I initially thought I was writing it for the tribe, for the citizens in the area. And two things came out of that conversation, which made the report much longer and harder. was one, that we have tribal citizens everywhere, not just in a 30-mile radius. You know, they're all over the world. And the other is that whatever we do for our tribal citizens and our non-tribal neighbors. And so I was curious from the presentation from Unalaska, and it was answered in the chat here a little bit, but I'd like to hear a little more, is when you're writing and getting information, and then developing it into solutions, are you considering solutions mostly for your tribal citizens or for the entire community around you? And how did that come out of the discussions with your teams?
So that's a question for Sheila.
Yeah, thank you, Kendra. That's a really good question. And I did highlight a lot on those solutions that relate directly to our tribal members. And the way we used our tribal members, actually, it just sort of happened was a lot of their prioritized next steps in how we address some of these issues naturally were related to culture and making sure, essentially protecting our culture from these changes, since we are so closely tied to the environment, and even more specifically in terms of subsistence. But we did include other next steps that benefit the entire community and even the broader Aleutian region. And those next steps came from our staff, in addition to other partnerships made. One thing I failed to mention while I was speaking is that we talked a lot and very closely with an organization called SNAP, and that's the Scenarios Network for Alaska and Arctic Planning. Essentially, what they have is a climate toolkit that shows existing data and then also projections as to what that means for the future. And so with that information, we did talk with non-tribal entities and other partners in identifying how we can use that information to benefit everybody. And basically what I think is that even when our, as a tribe, a lot of our projects benefit our tribal members, but really they usually benefit the community as a whole. We do have a small community here in Alaska, and so we don't limit a lot of our things to only tribal members, just because we are so close knit. I hope that was an adequate answer to your question.
Yes, thank you very much.
Great, yeah, thank you. And I see Robert has a hand up. Robert, go ahead.
Thank you. I had a question for Catherine for the second presentation. Just curious thoughts on, as you shared, of course, the East Coast, and I think about East Coast, a lot of that is tied to tourism, and we think about here on the West Coast of how our tribes and the lands are not tied to tourism and how much money is being spent there. But recently, federal government's given, I think $25 million to Quinault Nation here in Washington State, and a couple $1 million to entities up in Alaska to do what we call retreat, basically move our buildings, from the coastal inundation inward. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on that type of process, versus what's happening on the East Coast, which is really just really building up those, homes and helping non-tribal nations. So I'm just curious what your thoughts on that and like what you think is the best way to approach it here on the West Coast.
I think, one thing that needs to be looked at are what are the resources that are on your area. Like I know in Alaska that there have always been fighting to get the tribes off the coastal shores because they want to get at the oil and natural gas that's under there. So they're using this as a pretense to get you out of the way, pretty much. So what are your valuable resources that are on the coastal shores? That's what I would look at, number one. Number two, I would also look at the subsurface and see if whether or not there is bedrock underneath you. And if there isn't, then look at Norway. Norway is building, they have been building homes that float on the water. So they have really good systems already in existence that you can point to. And there are companies that do build floating homes. So for them to say that you need to retreat, I think is a bunch of garbage. And they need to really justify why the retreat is necessary when there are alternative building plans in place by other places that are affordable. So I honestly believe that they are using, because the West Coast is rich. We are super rich in resources, and they want those resources. And so I would definitely take a look at your value of your resources. I think it's pathetic that they're constantly rebuilding the beaches over on the eastern seaboard and telling us that we have to leave. Screw that. Sorry.
Oh, you know what,
Thank you for
Catherine,
that. I appreciate it.
you say it. We have time for one more question. So I see Celso has his hand up.
Yes, this is also, this is for Catherine or anybody on this session. Do you know if the FEMA has changed their cost benefit analysis in favor of rural and tribal communities? Does anybody know that? Because that's the big, for flood prone communities in floodways. That's been we on the Tohono Indian Reservation, we've had to pay for 3 of our projects because we did not qualify under FEMA cost benefit analysis. Has that changed? I thought that Biden would have set aside money for flood reduction projects. I read it, but I haven't found out if there is money.
I don't know about that, but one thing that really is puzzling to me is the benefit should include your like an ancillary benefit, like wetlands. Okay, when you have a wetlands, how many animals does it attract? How many people use the wetland for nature walks? How many acres does the wetland protect from flooding? So downstream, what is the value of those properties that the wetland is protecting from being flooded? You know, so you have 10 homes, they're each worth $100,000 a home. That's $1 million right there. That is a benefit that wetland is protecting. So think of your land in that regard. So and your fish stock, how much fish do you have? Or people want to go to see the tourism. Ecotourism is on the rise in every place across the globe that has wilderness still. How much of your wilderness, you know, the whales going up and down the coast, we have billions of dollars across the coastline because people have whale watching activities, the migratory birds are out there. You know, all of those are ancillary benefits. Those are benefits that for some reason are left out of the economical equation, which I don't understand because they all contribute to your tourism dollars. I mean, people need to eat, right? They go to the restaurants, they stay in your hotels, you know, they buy your gasoline, you know, et cetera, and so on. So I would really put a fight for getting those ancillary benefits included in the cost benefit analysis.
Yeah, I have to tell you that they're not included right now. The things that are included is population size and structural value.
But that's how they're getting it. That's how they're forcing.
Sure, I understand that, but
Yeah.
I just wanted to know if there was any changes in the cost benefit analysis, because most of the time, like right now, there's last year in 2021, 2022, there was $18 billion worth of damages across the nation. And all of that money FEMA went to those areas. And so our projects, we still got one more that needs, it's going to cost $7 million to protect the community. And normally, historically, we lived in the mountains, but when the BIA built wells for us, we came down into the alluvial plain, and now we're sitting in flood-prone areas. But I know that the last time I talked to somebody from FEMA, they said that they just go by population size and they go by structural value, and 0 to 1 is the requirement, and we never get up to 0.2. We don't qualify. We never qualify. We've been asking them in the Corps of Engineers to help us to build cost share these projects, and there is no money.
I would say that's discriminatory. I would say that's based on discrimination policy.
And Celso, I agree with everything you and both you and Catherine are saying. And we've got Jessica had put in the chat that she can email you and talk more about this. But when we're talking about the vulnerabilities that tribes have, this is something to include. One of our vulnerabilities is a lack of access, structural barriers, and go ahead and be straight up about it and say it's about systemic racism and discrimination. So I would love to continue this conversation, but we have half an hour left and we want to get to our breakouts. So we're going to be doing next 3 breakout sessions. So you're each going to be put into a breakout. And we want you to answer some questions that are going to be up on the slides. And Angie is going to be sharing those slides again as soon as I make her a co-host again. Sorry, I'm trying to multitask here. But we'll also put the questions in the chat. And they are about things like what would you do differently about your vulnerability assessment if you were doing it today? Or if you're still working on one, what have you learned so far that might inform your analysis? So we're going to go ahead and put you in those breakout rooms now. And also we're going to use the mural so that we can start putting down the notes for what we're all talking about. So stand by. I'm going to recreate our breakout rooms and you will be assigned automatically.
Yeah, so there's a few questions here for you as a group to discuss. So if you end up, each of us, Shasta, Tina, and I are going to end up in one of the groups. If you're in Shasta's group, you're going to put your answers here. And so Shasta, Tina, and I can help you if you have any issues with mural, but really it's just putting down one of these post-its and adding thoughts. And so there's a few questions here. We're going to talk about, what do you wish you had done differently in your vulnerability assessment if you had to do it again? What has worked well to engage the knowledge and perspectives of your tribal members in the development of your vulnerability assessment? How did you assess climate vulnerabilities to cultural resources while managing issues around sensitive information and confidentiality? And any problems that you might have encountered in accessing data, basically. So if you can't get to all these, you just pick the ones that you find most interesting in your group. And that's that. We're going to give you about 15 minutes for this breakout because we went a bit long in the last segment. So let's go ahead and break out and you'll end up in one group and we'll see you there.
Welcome back, everybody. Sorry again for the abrupt, probably cutting people off in the middle of the best idea that anybody's ever heard. But we're going to take the next probably just 10 minutes to do a report out on what we heard in our rooms. And I'm going to start because I was fortunate to have both of our presenters from today in our room. And then we had a couple of agency folks and another tribal member. And so I'm not going to put any of them on the spot. So I'm going to talk about briefly what we went over. And we talked a lot about engagement. As far as the doing things differently is concerned, it kind of went from there as we talked about engagement into some of these other issues. So engagement with tribal leadership is something that has been a difficulty. And so we talked about how to get through to the tribe and how to get through to the community. Some communities are really large. Some communities, like Heidi talked about in our group, are really small. So community engagement has to take different forms. So one of those kind of blind spots is being able to engage and overcome that problem. So there were some great ideas for a smaller community where everybody is related or knows each other. You bring it up when you're already together for something else. I joked, it's like having a Tupperware party. You invite people there under false pretenses, and next thing they know, they have to answer questions about climate change. But that's a way to do it. You just sit and talk with your family and do it in another environment. And sometimes you have to kind of pounce on them, but since they're already there. And then Sheila's idea that she talked about in her presentation, using your grant funding, you can write it into your grant to have money to give folks who are willing to come and be a part of your committee. And I've never done that. And I think I'm going to see if I can do that with some of my grants. Tim, you just put in the chat, tribal picnics are a great way to do that. Yeah. The Christmas party, especially when people are full of food, maybe they've had a beer and they're like, I'll tell you about climate change. Maybe that's just me. But another thing that's really important as far as sensitive information, and Sheila brought this up, reestablishing trust with the community. And I've had that issue in Paula too, especially since I'm not Indigenous, that a lot of information has been taken and used in ways that have been harmful to tribes. So be patient and don't expect immediate gratification. That's a little bit of a Western value, to expect to ask a question and get an answer and move on to the next thing. That doesn't happen in a lot of tribal communities. So patience and thinking outside the box were the theme of what we talked about. All right, that's me. Who's the breakouts recorder for group 2?
That's my group, but I actually want to invite anybody in my group to share some of the key themes if they'd like. And if not, I'll just summarize that some of those things resonated. A lot of those, we talked about patience, we talked about different approaches. And one of the things that came out in our group was about, if coming in sometimes with an expectation of maybe more Western influence, like Western planning approaches, using surveys, trying to do things efficiently from a Western perspective, but needing to do it differently. And so changing the model. And John, do you want to talk a little bit about what you did? We talked about moving around in space, in the physical environment.
Sure. I've been working with Ramona for probably 25 years. But as an environmental director, it hasn't been as long, but I've been in the cultural resource department for that. And Ramona's a smaller tribe. So let me just preface that. Ramona's a smaller tribe. So it's easier, or it was easier, to engage with the tribal leaders and the tribal members with regards to a lot of issues, especially this. And one of the things that was beneficial in developing the assessment and what have you was actually not having formal meetings, but just going out to the res and even the forest and talking about, not me talking, having them talk about what changes they've seen, because they live there. They've lived there for generations. And what they've noticed, and some of the feedback that we received had to deal with, where water used to be and where it's not now, where plants that they used to gather used to grow and where they don't grow now, and what they've seen over the last 30 years and why that's a concern for them, and then developing the assessment based off of that. And so I think, having meetings is fine, but I like to have my meetings in the field. I think that's for us, that has worked very well. So, I know that's not always available. That's not always something that can happen depending on the tribe and the reservation and the size of that. But I think that's something that could be an aspect of what you do when you're developing these plans.
Can I just add that is an extremely important part of doing your assessments, is actually knowing your landscape, knowing the history. I mean, anybody can tell you about it, but to actually see how it's changing, that will give a heck of a lot more information, seeing everything right before you. That is so important. I mean, I've seen environmental engineering plans or whatever drawn up from people that live thousands of miles away, and you go out and you try and fit their plans onto the landscape, and it doesn't work because they've forgotten to do something that they didn't see. So it's very important to visit the site.
So that was really good point. And then, this last question on sensitive information, the comment was, we probably need to tackle that with more time in a future session, just how to handle the sensitive information around cultural resources. So let's put a pin in that and to spend more time on that in a future session.
We got 5 minutes left. So group 3, you get to hustle through yours so we can have a few seconds at the end to talk about next time.
Things to do differently, I guess. One thing was just adding it to like their paid job description. Like they didn't know that this was a whole big undertaking of writing a vulnerability assessment was going to be a part of their job. And then having like a partner to do it with, because this, you know, is a big task to tackle on your own. And then engagement successes. So I believe that was Celso. He was saying that they are using it for like water and human health and food sustainability. So they are really using their vulnerability assessment, and they've gotten a lot of youth involvement. Some other things that were added here: monthly meetings, very interesting discussions between tribal and Western scientists, paleoclimate, hydrology, and interviews then include quotes in vulnerability assessment report. And then, so then going on to sensitive info. One way to kind of help this out was to write your own. And another point that was brought up is that, you know, like government agencies and whatnot should not be changing any wording to like help it fit, you know, whatever they're trying to accomplish. And then some blind spots. So when issues have come up, that was Celso again, I believe, that they have like a real time weather information that they get updated like every 5 minutes. And they produce like monthly maps and compare data. And it's very important that they, you know, have generated their own data and that it be sovereign data. And then, yeah, so I think I got that in that short amount of time.
Yeah, you did it. Woo! So I'm gonna let Angie wrap us up. We're already losing a couple of folks because they've got 12 o'clock meetings. So what's coming up for February?
Just want to say thank you so much for your participation today. There is that worksheet 3 that you can follow, and you can add some reflections in there if you'd like to kind of keep track of your thoughts. We have a suggested reading for you before we come back together in February. And so we're going to stick with the 5th National Climate Assessment Draft, and we're going to look at Chapter 15. This one's specific to human health. Obviously, the Tribal Climate Health Project. Health is a big focus area. And I just want to, encourage you to put some eyes on it in case there's anything in there that might be useful. It's the latest information coming out of the nation from a national perspective, but may be useful for you for your vulnerability assessments. Get off of federal stuff, federal reports for a while, and spend a little bit more time in readings that are coming from an indigenous authors, indigenous communities. So that'll be next time. And when we come back together in February, on February 16th, we're gonna then kind of move to the next step. So we talked mainly about vulnerability assessments today. Tomorrow, we're gonna talk about adaptation plans, which typically, come after vulnerability assessment. This is where we're actually putting pen to paper on strategies. How are we going to tackle these impacts? So the topic is preparing dynamic and actionable adaptation plans that protect tribal health and well-being. And I have a speaker here. I think Serena had offered to speak on this topic, and just wanted to encourage anybody to contact Shasta or I after this. If this is a topic that you really feel like you could speak to, and you get 10 minutes like we did today to share your experiences from your tribe. We would love to have one more speaker assigned for next time. So with that, thanks again. Shasta, any last remark?
No, except that I'm very sad to say I'm probably going to miss you next time, because I'll be at the National Association of Tribal Historic Preservation Officers Conference, and I'm the chair of that organization. So I kind of have to go, and I guess that means I have to do stuff. So if I can, I'll try to be on from North Carolina. But it looks like it's probably going to be the Angie and Tina show next time. So thank you again, everybody. It's always so wonderful to get all of your input. These have been 3 great sessions so far. We're 25% of the way through, and go out and enjoy what is hopefully for you a beautiful day. It's not raining in San Diego today. Get some sun, and we will see you all here next month.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.